Consideration of this bill after its first reading, and more importantly for conducting a very laudable public participation exercise and tabling their reports in a very timely manner. And I must commend this Finance Committee because they have now set the standard for this House on how and what constitutes qualitative and quantitative public participation, because they have been going around the country and listening to Kenyans on many aspects, and especially those that touch on the running of our economy. And this is one bill, Honorable Speaker, that is proposing to create a legal framework for the enhanced corporate governance and greater accountability of state-owned enterprises, or in the performance of what are government-owned or state-owned enterprises. Honorable Speaker, government-owned enterprises are state corporations, and the long and short of it, that are created to either for commercial activities or even for provision of what would otherwise be social or state obligations to its people. And many of our state corporations, Honorable Speaker, were established, some through under the Companies Act, many others through various acts of parliament, some even by legal notices, and others are established through regulations, Honorable Speaker. And this is the kind of framework that we have had over the years. And the principal objects of this bill is to ensure that all these government-owned enterprises now, whether they were created through acts of parliament, whether they were done through gazette notices as or legal notices, Honorable Speaker, or even under various other instruments, legal instruments, that they are now all governed under the Companies Act, and they, with the coming into force of this bill, when it becomes an act of parliament, if adopted by the House, all our state-owned enterprises or government-owned enterprises will now be registered as limited liability companies, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, these changes are informed by policy decisions and part of the reform package that was spoken to in, for those who remember, when we moved the medium-term strategy paper at the beginning of this year, in February of this year actually. These are some of the reforms that we did speak to that will be carried out in the course of this year, Honorable Speaker. And therefore, on the 3rd of November 2023, the Cabinet had approved an ownership policy for government-owned enterprises in Kenya, and also approved the commencement of the necessary legal reforms to give effect to the provisions of the ownership policy. And 5 is a translation now into law of the ownership policy, and is part of the wider and ongoing initiatives to deepen governance reforms in state corporations or the state corporation sector. And the proposals in the Government-Owned Enterprises Bill of 2025 are therefore informed by lessons from past experiences in Kenya and by established good corporate governance practices around the world, Honorable Speaker. And it is from this policy for government-owned enterprises, ownership policy, that this bill has borrowed from. And these reforms, Honorable Speaker, the government-owned enterprises reforms, at any one time, reflect the policy agenda of any government, which takes into account the domestic and global dynamics at the time. And that is why I said, Honorable Speaker, for our case, the reform plan is aimed at achieving a few key objectives, as outlined, as I said, in the medium-term development plan, which we passed as a House in February or late February this year, and towards the beginning of March, Honorable Speaker. Therefore, Honorable Speaker, when we see legislative proposals coming to the House, Honorable Speaker, they're all coming from nowhere. Because I've seen many people politicking out there saying, oh, government enterprises are being sold, government enterprises are being privatized. You know, shockingly, the people who see these things are members of parliament who actively participated in the passage of the medium-term development plan that spoke to these things, that a time would come that Pursuant to the policy, the ownership policy that had been passed in November of 2023, we will now legislate, and we are now at that point of legislating on the government-owned enterprises. And Honorable Speaker, I've said part of the reform package objectives is one, to build resilience within our economy to enable it to withstand any future shocks, Honorable Speaker. Two is to mobilize private sector resources to fund priority public infrastructure through innovative measures. And such innovative measures, Honorable Speaker, is what you've seen, that for the first time in over 40 years, this nation has never been able to build a stadium of the standard of Kasarani or Nyayo National Stadium. But we are now building a new stadium, Talanta Stadium on Gong Road. After 40 years, that is double the size of Nyayo, no, almost triple the size of Nyayo, because it's a 60,000 capacity stadium and double the size of Kasarani in terms of capacity. We will not have been able to do this without having innovative ways, Honorable Speaker, of funding these capital-intensive projects, Honorable Speaker. We are now talking about expanding Rironi, Mau Summit, all the way to Malaba Road. A road where Kenyans, especially in the run-up to Christmas like now, people going to the western part of Kenya spend hours, nights on that road. But we have to be innovative in how we finance these projects, Honorable Speaker. And therefore, that's why I said the first objective is to build resilience within our economy, to ensure that we're able to do those capital-intensive projects without overburdening taxpayers. Therefore, when you hear people out there oppose privatization, oppose some of these bills that we bring here, Honorable Speaker, in forums outside of Parliament, and they are members of Parliament, please tell them, for those of us out there, tell these members of Parliament, you are the ones who passed those laws in Parliament. You are the ones who passed the medium-term development plan. You are the ones who passed the privatization policy and the Privatization Act, which is a bill that is now an act of Parliament. And all these things are being done pursuant to that. Honorable Speaker, the other objective is to ensure that our capital markets develop. And Honorable Speaker, privatization provides diversity of bankable investments by the private sector through increased capital market liquidity and strengthening the financial sector, hence mitigate capital flight and sustaining macro and fiscal credibility of our economy. Therefore, the third objective is to ensure that we develop our capital markets, to ensure that Kenyans are not investing in the London Stock Exchange or the New York Stock Exchange, but are investing through our capital markets authority in the Nairobi Stock Exchange, and therefore ensuring that there is liquidity in our own economy and to grow our economy. The other objective is to enhance equitable development across the country, and reforms that are taken especially across the agricultural sector, like in the sugar, cotton, coffee, and milk subsectors, are aimed at ensuring that there is regional or there is promotion of regional development across the entire spectrum of our nation. Because, Honorable Speaker, the sugar subsector and those from the sugar belt in Western Kenya, Nyanza, and parts of our coast region will bear us witness that without the reforms that have been enacted in the sugar sector was one of the sectors in our agricultural sector that were dying. Honorable Speaker, we've been able to rescue this sector, and just like also the cotton industry or the cotton sector in parts of coast and Nyanza and Western Kenya, that is now vibrant, Honorable Speaker, because of the reforms package that have come with it. Therefore, Honorable Speaker, as I said, this bill will in a great way ensure that we are able to transition at least roughly about 80 state corporations or government-owned enterprises that were registered either under those that are listed under Schedule 2 of the bill, Honorable Speaker, many of which you see are state corporations that were registered under various acts of parliament, and others under Schedule 2, the second schedule, sorry, that was the first schedule, a list of about 66 government-owned enterprises that are registered under various state corporations acts, like the National Housing Corporation, Kenya Literature Bureau, the Kenya Pipeline Corporation itself, that's under the Kenya Pipeline Act. You will see Simlo Seeds, Kipchambo Tea, the Commodities Fund. Therefore, it tells you, Honorable Speaker, that many of these corporations were registered under various acts of parliament. There are also others, major ones like the Kenya Ports Authority. Again, a number of those on the second schedule that may have been incorporated through legal notices. And therefore, we will transition all these companies and move them to be registered under the Companies Act. And therefore, of the private sector players into the management and running of these state corporations, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, as we speak about building resilience in our economy, Honorable Speaker, we cannot do so without ensuring that we also leverage on capital or resources that are there in the private sector. And one of the best ways of leveraging on this private sector capital is to ensure that some of these state-owned enterprises also bring in the expertise in their management and governance structure of the private sector. And therefore, through privatization, as we said here, Honorable Speaker, when we're moving the privatization bill, we will be able to bring in private sector expertise and capital into the running of state-owned enterprises, and therefore enhance their corporate governance structures, including how you structure their boards and how you manage those particular companies, now as companies, limited companies, not as state-owned corporations established under Acts of Parliament. Honorable Speaker, the bill clearly outlines what it seeks to achieve, and it is comprehensively listed, as I said, in the bill without going into the specific details. But some of the primary objectives, again, of the bill are to establish an ownership regime and legal framework for better performance of government-owned enterprises, and the effective creation of value for members of the public who have invested in these companies, Honorable Speaker, that are owned by the people of Kenya through the government. Two is to establish a government structure that facilitates achievement of commercial objectives of government-owned enterprises. Because again, Honorable Speaker, there are many enterprises that are created for commercial purposes or for profit, but many of them that are government-owned either do not turn a profit or they turn out losses at the end of every year. Some were intended to be paying dividends to the government or the national treasury. They hardly ever do that. It's only in the recent past, Honorable Speaker, that you have seen when His Excellency the President actually made it compulsory that state corporations must pay dividends to the national treasury. And you have seen some, like the Kenya Pipeline, pay dividends of at least up to 5 billion, 7 billion shillings a year. I think the last dividends they paid was about 5 billion shillings. But these companies, you can derive more value from them, Honorable Speaker, even without owning them 100%. Two, Honorable Speaker, or three, is to enhance accountability and appropriate incentives for government-owned enterprises to operate on commercial principles. Because again, Honorable Speaker, many of our government-owned enterprises don't operate on commercial principles. And there's a lot of laxity in the management and governance structures of these state-owned enterprises, simply because they are run as parastatals, and there's also over-interference, even as much as the State Corporations Act makes it compulsory that parastatals or state-owned enterprises are not appendages of ministries or state departments. But we have seen, and those who sit in the Public Investments Committee, the Public Accounts Committee will bear me witness, that we have seen instances where principal secretaries, cabinet secretaries, seek to micromanage the running of state-owned enterprises. With the passage of this bill and the transition now in registering these companies as limited liability companies, the governance structure will change, and therefore there is no cabinet secretary or the principal secretary who will seek or will be able to micromanage any state corporation. Because even in instances where the structure had representatives in the board of principal secretaries, cabinet secretaries, it will now not be possible because the governance structure will change, Honorable Speaker, and you have private sector players or independent directors, Honorable Speaker. And the best case example I think we would be able to borrow from is what happened with KenGen and KPLC when they were privatized. And we saw in independent directors coming into the company. We've seen Kengen, KPLC have very good engineers, very good finance and legal experts who have enhanced the governance structures of those companies and grown them to be better companies as they were, better than they were when they were fully owned government entities. The other objective, Honorable Speaker, is to position the government as an informed and active owner that is neither too passive nor unduly interfering with government-owned enterprises. And that's what I was saying, Honorable Speaker. Because government is government, and ownership becomes passive, and nobody really owns these state corporations. But now with the changes, government ceases to be a passive owner and becomes an active participant in the day-to-day running of these enterprises without unduly interfering with their management, since there will be other players. The other objective is to establish a very transparent public service obligations, accounting and funding structure that does not interfere with commercial objectives of the government-owned enterprises. Honorable Speaker, this public service obligations business, Honorable Speaker, is one issue that can become a danger or a risk to any commercial enterprise. And I'll give you the classic example again of KPLC. KPLC has a public obligation to roll out power and connect Kenyans to power. And you remember some years back, it would cost, from commercial costing of KPLC, up to 70,000 shillings to connect a single household to power. But today, through subsidies by government, KPLC is able to connect Kenyans innovatively, almost for free. And you pay for your connection in the long run through your bills. And this, it is such social and public obligations, Honorable Speaker, that may, in a way, interfere with the commercial viability of companies. Because you can imagine if KPLC was to offer that public good or public service of connecting Kenyans to power. And those who were with us in Mombasa last week will remember the very extensive engagement that we had with the private sector. And central to all our discussions, especially those who engage with the energy sector, was the cost of power in Kenya and what the cost of power in this country does to the growth of industry, especially around manufacturing and value addition. And therefore, because as a nation, we need to connect industries to power. We need to connect homes to power. If we made that public obligation a duty or an obligation of KPLC as a company or as a state corporation, we interfere with the commercial viability of that company. And therefore, this particular bill will make it easier for the provision of such obligations, public obligations, to be done without necessarily interfering with the commercial viability of state corporations. And therefore, this bill seeks to establish a public service obligations, accounting and funding structure that does not interfere with the commercial objectives of the government-owned enterprises. And such public service obligations are obligations that the government may assign a government-owned enterprise or a state-owned enterprise to produce goods or provide services that are not financially viable to the government-owned enterprise, and for which a subsidy or full funding by the National Treasury is necessary for sustained production. And therefore, government, if government wants to roll out the connection of power through KPLC or probably through Ketraco, they should be able to provide for those resources within our budgets, or the National Treasury will be able to provide adequate funds to roll out those public obligations so that they do not interfere in any way with the commercial viability of that particular enterprise, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, I do not want to belabor too many points around this bill, but just to re-emphasize that this is a very important bill that will align the governance framework of our commercial state-owned enterprises and to position them to have the ability to undertake off-balance sheet government projects. As I said, those like Talanta, the roads that we are doing, the toll roads like the proposed Mau Summit, Rironi Road. Again, Honorable Speaker, KICC, which was built at the birth of our country, just immediately after independence in the late 60s and 70s, has been a convention center that is out of pace with the rest of the world. And many of us speak and say how Kenya is being overtaken in conference tourism by countries like Rwanda, smaller economies than Kenya's. But if you go to the convention center in Rwanda, in Kigali, Bishop probably is not fully owned by the government of Rwanda. And that is the norm everywhere around the world, Honorable Speaker. That you are leveraging on private capital to be able to deliver on public goods or to deliver services to the public and to even grow your economy, leveraging on private capital. Now, after almost close to 50 years, or nearly 50 years, Honorable Speaker, we are able to do a new convention center, the Bomas International Convention Center, again through this innovative model of financing. And therefore, Honorable Speaker, this bill is opening up such opportunities for our country so that we get off balance sheet. And getting off balance sheet, Honorable Speaker, means we get off the unaffordable credit that we were taken through in the last 10 or so years from 2013 to 2022. Because we borrowed heavily to finance SGR, to finance the construction of roads, to finance the rollout of electrification of our country, the rural electrification programs, that now, Honorable Speaker, we'll be able to innovatively raise capital off balance sheet to fund such capital-intensive projects as Bomas, a new KICC or a new convention center, and even a new airport, Honorable Speaker. This is how we'll be able to fund a new airport. I was with a number of colleagues in Mombasa last week, and when we landed in JKIA, even those who are opposing the modernization of JKIA, some months back, when we were riding in the bus, because we were dropped somewhere, I think near Rwai, towards the end of the runway. As we rode back on the bus to terminal, the domestic terminal, somebody commented that now this airport is full of tents. Fortunately, that person was one of the loudest people in opposing the modernization of our airport. And he had the audacity to say in that bus, oh, at that time we were just doing it for politics. We truly and honestly need an airport in this country. But that, Honorable Speaker, is just one of us, or a number of us. Many other Kenyans, Honorable Speaker, out there, who travel out of this country and see what is happening around our region, appreciate the need to have a new airport. They appreciate the need to have a new international convention center like that one that is going on in Bomas, or even new international standard, FIFA standard stadia like Talanta. And they also appreciate the need not to overtax Kenyans to be able to roll out these development programs. And also appreciate the need to ensure there is regional balance in the rollout of development programs around the country. And that is why you will see today we will have a new superhighway connecting the western part of Kenya that has been marginalized for many years, Honorable Speaker. Because it is true, when I'm going to see my in-laws in Nyeri over Christmas, it takes me less than an hour. Because there is a dual carriage from Kikuyu. I hit the southern bypass, join the expressway, join Thika Superhighway, and Marwa, Keno, Marwa, Sagana Road, all the way to Karatina. But for Honorable Karoli Omondi to go to his village in Suba,
Sometimes it takes us 2 days to get to Nakuru or Eldoret.
Or even the chair of the finance committee who bakes the cake to get to Sachangwani in Molo between the 12th of December and the 24th of December. You will be lucky if you make it in a day. That is the injustice and the disparities that we must address. At least the member from Boni with the expressway can get to Machakos junction in less than 40 minutes. But for Karoli Omondi or Millie Odhiambo to get to Suba, it will take them 3 days. We must speak to those other Kenyans in that other part of Kenya. And we must be sensitive that development in this country has not been fair. And for us to be able to equalize Kenyans and to roll out development programs to ensure you have a stadium in Kisumu, you have a stadium in Marsabit, you have affordable housing in Lodwar, just as you have in Makwiny. For us to be able to do that, we must think beyond the balance sheet. We must think beyond taxes. We must think innovatively. And that is what this bill is speaking to. That is just what this bill is speaking to in summary. That we will transition our state-owned enterprises into limited liability companies, enhance accountability, enhance the corporate governance of these organizations, for them to become more profitable for those that we keep, and for those that we eventually sell or privatize, we will be able to raise more capital or more money to roll out development programs. Because also there are those state corporations, Honorable Speaker, that were actually established to roll out development projects. And those, almost 260 or 240 of them, will not be affected by this bill. And I'll give you an example of the National Irrigation Authority, NIA. NIA is established to roll out development projects and is not a commercial entity, and therefore will not be affected by this bill, because this bill is specific to those entities that are engaged in commercial activities, so that we enhance their commercial viability, accountability, the governance structure, and ensure that we are deriving more value and greater value to the people of Kenya. Honorable Speaker, as I said, let me not belabor, because the bill is a very big bill with very many clauses, Honorable Speaker, and I'm sure members have gone through all these 40 clauses. There are a number of amendments that we'll be proposing in line with what the committee has done through public participation, views that they got from members of the public, and also other stakeholders. And when we come to the Committee of the Whole House, we'll be proposing a few amendments, and therefore I will not want to speak to them, since we have more time to speak to the amendments when we go to Committee of the Whole House. And I therefore beg to move and request the indomitable chair of the Finance and National Planning Committee, the member for Molo, the very progressive member for Molo, very promising legislator, very articulate and very focused, a man who has withstood a lot of negativity in this country, but stood to do what is right at the right time for the love of his country and the love of the people of Molo, who are Kenyans, and the love of many other Kenyans. May I request the member of Molo, the Honorable Kuria Kimani, my namesake and my son, to second.
Thank you very much.